Good morning, America. Tonight we begin with a tragedy that investigators across 4 continents had dreaded, documented, and now are presenting with evidence so overwhelming that even the Kremlin's most sophisticated propaganda machine cannot obscure it. A tragedy that unfolded not over hours of warning, but in 30 seconds that tore apart 298 lives. 30 seconds that scattered evidence across 50 square kilometers of Ukrainian farmland. 30 seconds that triggered the largest criminal investigation in aviation history. What Russian officials claimed was a Ukrainian false flag operation. What Moscow insisted never involved Russian weapons. What the Kremlin swore was Western fabrication designed to justify sanctions. Tonight, we're going to dismantle those lies piece by piece with evidence that cannot be disputed. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another conspiracy theory debunked. It's a turning point in how we understand state-sponsored murder disguised as collateral damage in modern warfare. For months before July 17, 2014, there had been signals, not official aviation warnings issued by international bodies, not formal military briefings distributed through diplomatic channels, just signals that the war in eastern Ukraine was escalating in ways that threatened civilian aircraft operating in what was supposed to be safe airspace. Intelligence services monitoring the conflict knew the indicators better than anyone. Pro-Russian separatists receiving advanced anti-aircraft systems from across the border, systems that required professional military training to operate. Ukrainian military planes being shot down at altitudes previously considered safe from shoulder-fired missiles. Encrypted communications between separatist commanders and their handlers in Moscow, discussing capabilities that farmers with assault rifles should never possess. Commercial airlines continuing to fly over active combat zones because international aviation authorities maintained that airspace above 32,000 feet remained officially safe from ground-based threats. All of those assumptions went unchallenged by airlines prioritizing fuel-efficient routes, and whenever military assumptions go unchallenged in an active war zone, it means something catastrophic is about to shatter them in the worst possible way. For weeks leading up to the incident, Russia had been watching the international response to their proxy war in eastern Ukraine, with a mixture of confidence and calculated risk. There were moments when Moscow believed that Western nations were too economically interconnected, too politically divided internally, too hesitant to impose meaningful consequences for what they framed as supporting ethnic Russians. There were signals, or what Moscow interpreted as signals, that suggested European dependence on Russian energy would prevent unified action against territorial aggression. German industry relied on Russian natural gas. French defense contractors had lucrative deals pending. British financial institutions processed Russian oligarch money. But those calculations, we now know with hindsight, were dangerously short-sighted. Because while Moscow was testing Western resolve with incremental escalations, they were also arming separatist forces with weapons systems designed for professional militaries, not irregular combatants fighting from improvised positions. And they did it, believing plausible deniability would protect them from accountability if something went wrong. That assumption held right up until the moment it catastrophically failed, and when it failed in front of the entire world, watching in real time. Early on the morning of July 17, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 took off from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport on schedule. Equipment Boeing 777-200 extended range, one of the most reliable aircraft in commercial aviation. Registration 9, Mike Romeo Delta, age 17 years of service. Maintenance record absolutely spotless, with no incidents. On board were 283 passengers representing 17 different nationalities and 15 crew members. The youngest passenger was a 1-year-old infant traveling with her family on summer vacation. The oldest was an 82-year-old man visiting relatives he hadn't seen in years. 80 children were on that flight, excited for adventures, clutching toys, watching movies, completely unaware this routine journey would end in tragedy. Among the passengers were world-leading HIV/AIDS researchers heading to the International AIDS Conference in Melbourne, where their work could have saved thousands of lives across developing nations. Families returning from summer vacations in the Netherlands with digital cameras full of photos they would never get to share. Students embarking on gap-year adventures they had planned for months. Young professionals flying to Australia for career opportunities. Elderly couples visiting children who had emigrated years before. At 12:15 p.m. local time, the aircraft departed on a routine flight path that hundreds of commercial airliners had flown without incident over the previous months. The route took them over Germany, Poland, and into Ukrainian airspace at cruising altitude 33,000 feet, well above the conflict zone below. Nothing unusual in the flight plan, nothing threatening about the route. Just another day in modern aviation, until it wasn't. At 4:20 p.m. and 3 seconds local time, Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 was maintaining standard altitude and speed over eastern Ukraine. The cockpit crew was in routine communication with Ukrainian air traffic control coordinating handoffs between sectors. Weather conditions were clear with unlimited visibility. All systems were nominal. The passengers were likely reading, sleeping, watching entertainment systems, completely unaware of the war raging 33,000 feet below them. 30 seconds later, the aircraft vanished from radar. Not gradually like mechanical failure, not with a distress call from the pilots, instantly, complete disappearance from every radar system tracking European airspace. What happened in those 30 seconds would become the subject of the most extensive forensic investigation in aviation history, involving experts from multiple nations and disciplines. A Buk M1 surface-to-air missile, launched from a field near the town of Snizhne in separatist-controlled territory, streaked upward at hypersonic speed exceeding Mach 3. The missile's proximity fuse, designed to detonate before physical impact, triggered the warhead 65 feet from the cockpit, slightly above and to the left of the aircraft's nose. High-velocity shrapnel, traveling faster than the speed of sound, perforated the fuselage like a shotgun blast, each fragment carrying enormous kinetic energy. The 3 crew members in the cockpit died within 1 second from catastrophic injuries. The cockpit section immediately separated from the fuselage as structural integrity collapsed. The rest of the aircraft, still structurally intact for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, began breaking apart as aerodynamic forces exceeded design limits never meant to be tested. Passengers in the rear sections likely experienced moments of confusion, perhaps noticing sudden decompression before catastrophic structural failure. 298 people began falling from 33,000 feet through clear blue sky, some still strapped in their seats, some clutching armrests, some holding hands with loved ones, some never knowing what happened. Within hours of the crash, social media exploded with evidence that would eventually convict 3 men in a Dutch courtroom 8 years later. A video emerged showing a Buk missile launcher being transported through the center of Snizhne at 9 a.m. on July 17th, time stamped by the camera, geotagged by smartphone metadata, filmed by multiple witnesses from different angles. The launcher clearly visible with its full complement of 4 missiles mounted on the chassis. Residents recognized it immediately as Russian military equipment they had never seen in their region before. Then another video surfaced the next morning, July 18th, showing the same vehicle, the same Buk launcher, missing 1 missile from its load, being transported back toward the Russian border under cover of darkness on a truck convoy, burn marks clearly visible on the launch rail in high-resolution footage. the kind of distinctive marks left by a missile that has been fired, scorching that professional analysts recognized immediately. Witnesses reported seeing the bright vapor trail ascending, hearing the massive explosion that shook windows, watching debris fall from the sky like burning rain across sunflower fields. And then, just 30 minutes after impact, a social media post appeared on the official page of Igor Girkin, also known by his battlefield call sign Strelkov, the separatist military commander with direct ties to Russian intelligence services. The post bragged about shooting down what they believed was a Ukrainian military Antonov 26 transport aircraft. It included specific details about the crash site location near Torres. But within 90 minutes, someone realized the catastrophic mistake they had made. The post was hastily deleted from the page. Screenshots had already spread worldwide through Twitter, Facebook, international media. Too late. The digital evidence was preserved in multiple archives. The lie was already unraveling before Moscow could coordinate a response. Russian state media immediately launched a coordinated disinformation campaign with industrial precision that revealed months of preparation for managing information crises. Within hours, competing narratives flooded every channel, every platform, every outlet that Russian information operations could reach. They claimed Ukraine shot down the plane deliberately to frame Russia, despite Ukraine having absolutely no motive to murder international passengers, including their own citizens and allies. They suggested the real target was Putin's presidential aircraft, returning from a Latin American summit, even though detailed flight path analysis showed the two planes were never within 300 kilometers of each other. They implied the bodies were already dead, planted at the scene in some grotesque CIA false flag operation, a claim so morally depraved that even hardened intelligence analysts struggled to comprehend its cruelty toward grieving families. They accused Western intelligence services of orchestrating the entire event to justify economic sanctions that were already being discussed, conveniently ignoring the logistical impossibility of such a massive conspiracy. Each claim directly contradicted the previous one. Each narrative collapsed under minimal scrutiny from fact-checkers, because the goal was never consistency or truth. The goal was confusion on a massive scale. Flood the information space with so many competing narratives that truth becomes indistinguishable from fiction in the public mind. Create enough doubt that investigations stall, that international pressure dissipates, that families lose hope of justice, that the world moves on to the next crisis before accountability arrives. It's a strategy perfected over decades of Soviet disinformation operations during the Cold War. Throw out 10 different lies, knowing 9 will be thoroughly debunked, but hoping the 10th might gain traction among conspiracy theorists. Overwhelm fact-checkers with sheer volume of false claims. Exploit the fundamental asymmetry where lies spread faster than careful corrections. Make defending truth so exhausting that people give up. But this time, the investigators absolutely refused to move on or give up. Dutch authorities, having lost 193 of their citizens in this attack, led an international joint investigation team with representatives from Australia, which lost 38 citizens, Belgium, Malaysia, which owned the aircraft and lost crew and passengers, and Ukraine, where the crime occurred. They established unprecedented cooperation across jurisdictions that normally compete. They recovered wreckage scattered across 50 square kilometers of active combat zone, documenting every piece with forensic precision, cataloging every serial number, photographing every fragment before careful removal. They analyzed flight data recorders that miraculously survived the impact, extracting every millisecond of cockpit voice recordings and flight parameters. They conducted forensic autopsies on remains recovered from the crash site, cataloging every injury pattern, every piece of embedded shrapnel, every wound characteristic. They interviewed witnesses who risked serious retaliation to provide testimony about what they saw. They obtained satellite imagery from commercial providers and military intelligence sources. They collected soil samples from the suspected launch site, showing chemical residue consistent with missile propellant combustion. They even reconstructed large sections of the aircraft piece by piece in a hangar outside Amsterdam, laying out the fuselage like a giant three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle showing exactly how the damage occurred and from what direction. And in that meticulous reconstruction process, they found something Moscow absolutely couldn't explain away with propaganda. Scattered throughout the debris field across Ukrainian farmland, investigators discovered thousands of metal fragments, small pieces, each no larger than a finger, but each one telling the same story. But under microscopic analysis and metallurgical testing, each fragment revealed its origin: shrapnel from a 9M38 Buk missile warhead specifically designed to destroy aircraft. The metallurgical composition matched Russian military specifications exactly. The distinctive shape matched the pre-formed fragments in Buk warheads precisely. The explosive residue matched chemical signatures unique to this Russian weapon system. Inside the bodies of crew members recovered from the crash site, pathologists found identical fragments embedded deep in bone and soft tissue. The wound patterns were absolutely consistent with high-velocity projectiles penetrating from an external explosion, not from inside the aircraft. Not from a bomb planted on board, not from mechanical failure or fuel tank explosion, not from pilot error or flight control malfunction. A surface-to-air missile fired from separatist-controlled territory using Russian military equipment operated by Russian-trained personnel. The forensic evidence became so overwhelming that even Russia's most creative propagandists struggled to dismiss it with straight faces, so they pivoted to a different approach. They claimed the investigation itself was biased from the beginning, that Western nations were fabricating evidence to justify pre-planned sanctions, that Ukraine somehow had access to identical Buk systems and framed Russia. Each deflection became more desperate than the last as evidence mounted. But here's where the story becomes even more damning and showcases the power of open-source investigation in the digital age. Independent investigators at Bellingcat, a group of citizen journalists and analysts using only publicly available information anyone could access, accomplished what many intelligence agencies thought impossible. They traced the specific Buk launcher involved in the shoot-down, using nothing but social media posts, Google Earth satellite imagery, photogrammetry, and meticulous frame-by-frame analysis. They started with the multiple videos posted on July 17th, showing the launcher being transported through Snizhne. They identified distinctive physical features, unusual scratches on the protective hull, a specific arrangement of camouflage netting that looked hastily applied, a unique pattern of rust forming on the chassis from years of service. Then they systematically searched through tens of thousands of photos on Russian social media platforms, particularly VKontakte, which is Russia's equivalent of Facebook, looking for matches to these distinctive features. They found photos from June 2013 showing the exact same launcher at a Russian military base in Kursk during Air Defense Forces Day celebrations. Same scratches on the hull, same unusual rust pattern, same identification number partially visible under poorly applied white paint. They cross-referenced these historical photos with commercial satellite imagery showing the launcher's movement from Kursk military base toward the Ukrainian border in mid-July 2014. They analyzed shadows in photos to verify timestamps with astronomical precision, using sun position calculations to confirm exactly when and where images were taken. They identified unit insignias visible on uniforms of soldiers photographed standing near the launcher, shoulder patches that corresponded specifically to Russia's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade based in Kursk region. They tracked its movement across the Russian-Ukrainian border into separatist-held territory, through Donetsk city center, where additional photos emerged, towards Snizhne, arriving at the area near the launch site just hours before MH17 was destroyed. The level of detail these civilian investigators achieved was absolutely extraordinary and embarrassed intelligence agencies. They identified the specific transport truck used by matching tire wear patterns visible in different photos taken weeks apart. They traced the exact route by comparing backgrounds in videos with Google Street View imagery, identifying specific buildings, road intersections, distinctive road signs, even playground equipment visible in backgrounds. They documented every sighting, every photo, every video, building a timeline so comprehensive and interconnected that Russian denials became increasingly absurd. Then they tracked the launch's return journey on July 18th, moving under darkness back toward the Russian border, missing one missile from its original complement, with distinctive burn marks clearly visible on the launch rail in high-resolution photographs that Russian officials initially claimed were digitally fabricated until metadata analysis proved authenticity beyond doubt. The investigation didn't stop at identifying equipment. Bellingcat and partner organizations identified actual people involved in the operation. They used facial recognition software cross-referenced with social media profiles that Russian soldiers hadn't scrubbed carefully or quickly enough. They found Instagram posts from Russian military personnel geotagged in eastern Ukraine during the exact period when these individuals officially claimed to be on routine leave visiting family in Russia. They discovered V-contact photos showing military personnel posing with advanced weapons systems at locations that matched the launch site area. They identified commanders by analyzing intercepted communications released by Ukrainian intelligence and matching voice patterns with publicly available interviews these officers had given to Russian media. Former Russian intelligence officers who had supposedly retired years earlier were conclusively identified in Ukrainian combat zone photographs. GRU colonels who officially worked comfortable desk jobs in Moscow were identified in battlefield footage coordinating operations. Professional military personnel with years of specialized training, not local farmers or miners, operating sophisticated weapon systems worth millions of dollars, not captured Ukrainian equipment as Moscow claimed, under coordinated command structures reporting to Russian military intelligence, not independent militia actions by local separatists. The web of evidence became so dense, so thoroughly interconnected, so comprehensively documented across multiple independent sources that denying Russian military involvement required simultaneously denying basic physics, dismissing authenticated photography, rejecting mathematics, and abandoning logic entirely. Here's what makes all this evidence completely impossible to dismiss, even with the most sophisticated propaganda. Investigators working with the Dutch Safety Board conducted an unprecedented experiment to validate their conclusions beyond any possible doubt. They test-fired an actual 9 M38 Buk missile at a decommissioned aircraft fuselage under carefully controlled conditions to create a comparison dataset. They wanted to prove, beyond any conspiracy theory, beyond any propaganda claim, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the specific damage pattern visible on MH17 wreckage matched only a Buk missile strike and nothing else. The experimental results were absolutely identical to the actual crash evidence. The fragmentation pattern matched perfectly. The perforation angles through aluminum skin matched precisely. The shrapnel distribution density matched exactly. The distinctive butterfly-shaped metal fragments found embedded in victims' bodies matched the Buk warhead design specifications perfectly. Every single forensic detail confirmed what eyewitnesses reported seeing, what satellite imagery clearly showed, what intercepted communications explicitly revealed, and what Bellingcat investigators meticulously proved through open-source methods. A Russian Buk missile system, serial number 332 from the 53rd Brigade, fired from separatist-controlled territory near Snizhne, killed 298 innocent people. No amount of Kremlin propaganda could erase the physics of the explosion. No amount of state media manipulation could alter the metallurgy of the fragments. No amount of diplomatic pressure could change the chemistry of the explosive residue. The evidence existed completely independent of politics, utterly immune to spin, totally indifferent to power. Russian officials systematically tried every deflection technique in their well-practiced playbook. They claimed Ukraine shot down the plane using their own Buk systems. Investigators conclusively proved Ukrainian systems were nowhere near the eastern region during the relevant time frame. They claimed the target was actually Putin's presidential aircraft. Detailed flight path analysis showed the planes were never remotely close. They claimed the CIA orchestrated everything. Absolutely zero evidence supported this fantasy scenario. They released satellite photos they claimed proved Ukrainian military involvement. Independent image analysis experts immediately identified obvious digital manipulation and fabrication. They held elaborate press conferences with technical presentations. Aviation experts dismantled every claim within hours. They produced supposed witnesses who contradicted physical evidence. Investigators verified these witnesses were coached. Each lie collapsed under professional scrutiny. Each deflection created new contradictions that required additional lies. Until finally, Russia's official position devolved into simply deny everything, admit nothing whatsoever, demand impossible proof standards, then claim all proof presented is fabricated by Western intelligence. It's the propaganda playbook of authoritarian regimes everywhere throughout history. But it fundamentally doesn't work when investigators spend 8 years methodically building an evidence chain so comprehensive, so redundant, so thoroughly cross-verified that denial becomes not just implausible but actually absurd. Intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's decision to provide advanced Buk systems to separatist forces was specifically designed to test Western response to increasingly brazen military escalation in Ukraine. Putin wanted to determine whether advanced weapons transfers would trigger meaningful sanctions, whether shooting down Ukrainian military aircraft would provoke international intervention, whether the West would maintain economic ties despite mounting evidence of direct Russian military involvement, whether plausible deniability still worked in the age of social media and satellite imagery. For months before MH17, that gamble appeared to be paying off exactly as Moscow calculated. Ukrainian military transport planes were being systematically destroyed. Ukrainian fighter jets were being shot down. Separatist forces were gaining territorial control. Moscow maintained blanket denials, while simultaneously celebrating military victories on state television. Western nations issued concerned statements, but took no decisive action. European energy dependence constrained responses. But then someone operating that Buk system made a catastrophic targeting error that changed everything. They mistook a civilian airliner painted in Malaysia Airlines livery for a Ukrainian military transport. They fired without proper identification. They killed citizens from 17 nations, including many EU member states. And suddenly, Russia wasn't just fighting a proxy war in eastern Ukraine. They were facing international criminal investigations, comprehensive economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and families from around the world demanding justice. The one scenario Moscow's strategic planners never adequately prepared for was genuine accountability for their actions. What makes this case so strategically significant and so personally dangerous for Putin's political survival is that it happened at a time when he was consolidating domestic power through carefully manufactured external crises. Russian state media had spent months portraying him as the strong protector of ethnic Russians living abroad, the decisive leader who wouldn't back down from NATO expansion, the strategic genius who outmaneuvered Western politicians at every turn. But the shoot-down of MH17 brutally exposed something Moscow desperately wanted to keep hidden from both international observers and domestic audiences. That Russia's military adventurism wasn't precision operations conducted by elite professional forces, as propaganda claimed. It was dangerous chaos managed by proxy forces using advanced weapons they couldn't properly operate. That Russia's blanket denials weren't credible strategic ambiguity. They were transparent lies, systematically contradicted by overwhelming evidence from multiple independent sources. That Putin's projection of strength wasn't calculated risk management. It was reckless escalation that murdered 298 innocent civilians and then attempted to blame literally everyone except those actually responsible. For a leader who built his entire domestic legitimacy on projecting competence, control, and strength, MH17 revealed catastrophic incompetence, loss of control, and profound weakness. And that revelation, perhaps even more than any economic sanction, threatened his grip on power. The Dutch Public Prosecution Service spent 8 painstaking years building the most comprehensive criminal case in international aviation history. They analyzed 11,000 separate data points from flight recorders. They interviewed more than 500 witnesses across multiple continents. They reconstructed missile trajectories using advanced physics simulations and computational fluid dynamics. They obtained intercepted communications between separatist commanders and their Russian handlers, explicitly discussing the shoot-down in real time as it unfolded. They collected testimony from individuals who participated in transporting the Buk launcher. They proved beyond any reasonable doubt whatsoever that the Buk missile came from Russia, was operated by Russian-trained military personnel, and was transported back to Russia immediately after the attack to hide evidence. In November 2022, a Dutch court convicted 3 men in absentia after reviewing thousands of pages of evidence. Igor Girkin, the separatist commander with direct FSB connections, Sergei Dubinsky, a GRU colonel operating undercover, Leonid Karchenko, a field coordinator, all found guilty of murder under international law, all sentenced to life imprisonment. Russia immediately refused to extradite them, claiming the trial was politically motivated. Russia refused to recognize the court's jurisdiction despite international law. Russia refused to acknowledge any Russian involvement whatsoever, despite evidence that would convict in any legitimate court. Because acknowledging truth would require admitting that Russian military weapons murdered children traveling to summer vacation. That Russian military commanders gave orders that killed AIDS researchers who dedicated careers to saving lives. That Russian denials were calculated lies from the very beginning, designed to evade accountability. Meanwhile, the families of 298 victims continue waiting for something beyond legal verdicts. Not closure, because closure isn't possible when your loved one is murdered, but acknowledgement. Basic human acknowledgement. Some minimal recognition that their family members didn't die in a random tragic accident, but were deliberately murdered by a state actor that refuses to admit what the entire international community knows happened. One family lost 3 generations in 30 seconds of violence. Grandmother who survived World War II and lived through Nazi occupation. Father who had built a successful career helping others. 2 young boys excited about their first trip abroad, carrying new cameras their parents bought them. Their last photograph together was taken at the departure gate, posted to social media minutes before boarding, smiling, waving, excited for adventure. 3 hours later, they were falling from the sky over a war zone they didn't even know existed. Another victim was a decorated military veteran who had survived a helicopter crash in Afghanistan while serving his country under hostile fire. He had faced Taliban fighters. He had survived improvised explosive devices. He came home alive from an active war zone where he faced mortal danger daily for months. He retired with honors and started a family. He was flying to visit his daughter, who had moved abroad for university. And then he died on what should have been a routine commercial flight because someone in a field in eastern Ukraine pushed a button without properly confirming their target. The cruelty of that randomness, the complete senselessness of these deaths haunts everyone who studies this case seriously. Military personnel who survived combat dying on civilian flights, children who never reached their destinations. Researchers whose work would have saved thousands of lives cut short before their conference. Among the passengers was a couple who had been married for 52 years. They were traveling together to visit grandchildren they hadn't seen in 3 years. They held hands during takeoff, a ritual they maintained on every flight. They were found still holding hands in the wreckage. Another passenger was a young medical student who had deferred her studies for a year to volunteer in refugee camps. She was flying home to finally start medical school after saving money. She had posted on social media about her excitement to begin this new chapter. Her medical school held an empty seat ceremony in her honor. The crash site itself became a crime scene like no other in aviation history. Pro-Russian separatists controlled the area, heavily armed forces who had no training in evidence preservation or crash investigation protocols. They prevented international investigators from accessing the site for days, while crucial evidence degraded or disappeared. Witnesses reported seeing armed men loading wreckage onto trucks at night and transporting it away. Local residents who tried to photograph evidence had their phones confiscated. One woman who filmed the Buk launcher being transported after the attack had her home raided and her computer seized. The video had already been uploaded to cloud storage. When investigators finally gained access weeks later, they found evidence of systematic tampering. Personal belongings had been looted. Wreckage had been moved. The debris field had been contaminated by unauthorized personnel walking through it. And yet, despite this interference, despite the hostile environment, despite the deliberate destruction of evidence, investigators still gathered enough material to build an absolutely conclusive case. The coming years will prove absolutely critical for determining whether this case sets precedent for accountability in modern warfare. Ukraine's current fight against Russia's full-scale invasion has renewed intense international focus on Moscow's consistent pattern of military aggression and systematic denial. MH17 wasn't an isolated tragic incident. It was part of a documented broader strategy of hybrid warfare, plausible deniability, and information manipulation that continues today across multiple domains. The exact same tactics used to deny responsibility for shooting down a civilian airliner are being systematically deployed to deny war crimes in Bucha, Mariupol, Kherson, and across occupied Ukrainian territory. The same propaganda techniques used after MH17 are being used right now. The same absolute refusal to acknowledge documented reality. The same victim blaming suggesting Ukraine somehow attacks itself. The same proliferation of absurd conspiracy theories blaming everyone from NATO to local Ukrainian forces. The same coordinated deployment across state media, social platforms, and diplomatic channels. Because for Putin's regime, admitting any truth means admitting systemic weakness that undermines the entire foundation of his political legitimacy. And weakness in his zero-sum political calculus developed over decades in intelligence services is worse than being internationally recognized as responsible for mass murder of civilians. That calculation might have seemed defensible in 2014, when the world was less prepared to confront Russian aggression directly, when European dependence on Russian energy constrained responses, when Western political will seemed divided and uncertain, when the international order appeared too weak to impose meaningful consequences. But today, that same calculation is increasingly failing, as evidence accumulates faster than it can be suppressed, as diplomatic isolation deepens beyond what Moscow anticipated, as economic sanctions prove more durable than expected, and as the systematic lies become increasingly transparent to international audiences. The international response to MH17, while inadequate in delivering justice, did mark a turning point in Western policy toward Russia. The European Union imposed the first serious sectoral sanctions targeting Russian energy, finance, and defense industries. The United States designated specific individuals and entities for asset freezes and travel bans. Australia, which lost 38 citizens, took an especially hard line in diplomatic forums. Malaysia demanded answers that never came from Moscow. The Netherlands, having lost the most citizens, led the criminal investigation with unprecedented resources and political commitment. These measures didn't bring the perpetrators to trial in person, but they did signal that killing nearly 300 civilians from 17 nations would have lasting consequences that Moscow couldn't simply wait out or ignore. What also emerged from this tragedy was enhanced aviation security protocols worldwide. Airlines now have access to real-time conflict zone information. Military coordination with civilian aviation authorities improved dramatically. No-fly zones are established faster and based on threat assessments rather than waiting for incidents. International regulations now mandate that states at war must close their airspace to civilian traffic if they cannot guarantee safety. These changes came too late for the 298 victims of MH17, but they may prevent future tragedies when commercial aviation intersects with military conflict. The question remains whether states will comply with these protocols, or whether political and economic pressures will again lead to dangerous compromises with passenger safety. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is undeniable. Russia's denials are provable lies contradicted by physics, chemistry, metallurgy, and documentary evidence. The evidence is overwhelming from multiple independent sources using different methodologies, all reaching identical conclusions. 298 people were murdered by a Russian Buk missile system operated by Russian-trained military forces under Russian command structures with Russian logistical support. And the state responsible refuses to acknowledge what every credible investigation proved conclusively, what every legitimate court confirmed unanimously, what every piece of forensic evidence demonstrates beyond doubt. Because for Vladimir Putin, maintaining the lie has become more important than honoring the dead, more important than providing closure to families, more important than Russia's international reputation, more important than basic human decency. And that choice, more than the original crime itself, reveals everything about the authoritarian regime he has built and leads. A regime where power trumps truth, where propaganda replaces accountability, where the murder of innocent civilians becomes acceptable collateral damage in geopolitical games. At Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, where MH17 began its final journey, there stands a memorial that has become a place of pilgrimage for families. 298 trees were planted, one for each victim. Each tree has a small plaque with a name, an age, a nationality. On the anniversary of the tragedy, families gather here. They touch the trees, they leave flowers and photos. They stand together in silence, united by grief and by the ongoing fight for justice that binds them across 17 nationalities and cultures. The memorial isn't about closure, it's about remembering, it's about refusing to let the world forget. It's about ensuring that these 298 lives are remembered as more than statistics in a geopolitical conflict. In the Netherlands, where the wreckage now sits preserved in a warehouse, families can request private visits to see the reconstructed aircraft sections. It's a profoundly difficult experience. Parents see the seats where their children sat, Spouses see the damage that killed their partners. They can touch the metal. They can see the perforation patterns. They can understand, in the most visceral way possible, exactly what happened in those 30 seconds over Ukraine. The Dutch Safety Board maintains this memorial not for morbid purposes, but because families deserve to see the evidence. They deserve to understand. They deserve confirmation that the investigation was thorough, that the conclusions are sound, that justice, however incomplete, was pursued with every resource available. We will be here watching as new evidence continues to emerge from ongoing investigations, as independent researchers uncover additional details, as diplomatic pressure continues, as families refuse to stop demanding justice they rightfully deserve. If you found this analysis valuable and want to understand other geopolitical cases that powerful nations want forgotten, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're committed to covering the stories that matter, the investigations that seek truth, the cases where evidence contradicts official narratives. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what really happened to MH17. And drop a comment below with your perspective. Do you think Russia will ever admit responsibility for this crime? Or will MH17 remain another atrocity they deny despite overwhelming proof that convinces every independent observer? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on accountability, justice, and whether international law has any real meaning when powerful nations choose to ignore it.